Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Vedic Astrology podcast. My name is Fiona Marks. Today we have a fascinating exploration for you. We are diving a little bit deeper into the world that we started looking at last episode. You'll remember we had a look at the Punya Shaham, the lucky auspicious Shaham, but also the strife Shaham, and a case study of someone's life who'd recently been convicted of fraud. Well, today we're taking that even deeper. We're going to look at the intriguing world of successful psychopaths and see what we can unmask about their secrets through Vedic astrology. My guest joining me today is Inkeri. She is our very own true crime expert, and she joined us in season 1 when we looked at the Brinks Mat robbery crime scene. And today she's back bringing to our attention how a birth chart case study can be used to help us understand something like psychopathy, chronic lying and manipulation, and a grandiose sense of self and one's success and impulsivity. It's going to be fascinating. I hope you'll join us. Let's get started. Inkeri, it's great to have you back. Today we're going to talk about this psychopathy checklist. Tell us a little bit about how you became interested in this particular area of astrology.
I think it's watching a lot of documentaries about psychopaths. I used to have a friend in London who was training to be a psychotherapist, and she forced me to watch all these documentaries. And I've got a very strong Saturn, so that's probably responsible for this grim worldview and the fascination with the darker side of life.
You certainly are our true crime expert on the Vedic Astrology podcast. You were with us in season 1, episode 7. We looked into the Vedic astrology of a crime scene.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. I loved doing that. I really did.
It's taken a while, but we're back again, and we are revisiting one of your papers from the practicum year of the Vedic Astrology apprenticeship. So Inkeri and I are colleagues. We went through the apprenticeship at the same time. It was a rigorous 3-year program for us. It's now the 2-year program on Teachable, so it's even more intense. And if you're able at the end of that to demonstrate your ability to read 2 blind charts, 2 charts that you don't know the person at all, if you're able to demonstrate that in an exam, then you get invited to do the practicum year. And there are many components to that, but one of them is 3 of these research papers that are 10,000 words and gives us as apprentices a chance to really delve into something. And one of your papers, Inkeri, was about astrology and psychopathy.
That's right, it was.
And so we're taking that as our launching point for the podcast today. I don't know if people are like me, but I hear the word psychopath and I'm hearing serial killer, and I've got the psycho music. It seems quite intense. Am I exaggerating what a psychopath is then?
The first thing to say is that 1 person in every 100 in the population is actually a psychopath. So it's very likely that all of us during the course of our lives are going to meet 1, 2, 3, or even more. So the first thing to say is that not all psychopaths are criminals. And many psychopaths are extremely successful in society because they have a lot of characteristics that will propel them towards that success. Okay, some of the tendencies will be things like egocentricity or being amoral, for example. But the other side of it is someone who's very ruthless, who's very focused on their goals. These are the kind of qualities, ruthlessness, for example, focus, coolness under pressure, that are very desirable in many professions. And, for example, many CEOs, politicians or surgeons or people in the military are psychopaths. many successful ones. Not all psychopaths are out there committing crimes. The point is that the psychopaths who are criminals are responsible for 50% of all violent crimes. So you might have 20% of prisoners who are psychopaths responsible for half of all violent crime. First thing to say is that psychopaths are born and not made. And that's why it's so interesting to look at an astrology chart. The other thing is that the diagnosis of a psychopath is the result of analyzing a checklist that was developed by Dr. Robert Hare in Canada. And it's 20 characteristics, and it's a sliding scale. So there are 20 characteristics on the list, and the more points you get, the more likely you are to be psychopathic. But everyone has some of these tendencies. So the average person might have 10 points out of 40. Someone in prison who's guilty of antisocial behavior might have 20 points. But to be a psychopath, you've got to have 30 out of 40.
I agree that we might see a little bit of ourselves in this list. In the past, there has been a practice of using this checklist to actually recruit people for particular jobs.
That's right. There is some speculation that the 2008 financial crisis was caused due to the reckless behavior of traders, because when the psychopathy checklist was released, a number of investment banks got hold of this document and were actually recruiting people on the basis that they were high scoring on the list, because the banks thought that if you're very ruthless and you can go for your goals without holding back at all, then that would make you a very useful employee when you're doing high risk trading, because you're able to take the pressure. But what they failed to understand is that because psychopaths don't have a strong or any moral compass, and they were gambling with other people's money, then they didn't care that they lost millions. But if you think about James Bond, for example, James Bond would be an archetypal psychopath, but he is a character that's very admired in our society because he's cool under pressure. He can kiss you and then kill you.
And then tell us a little bit about psychopaths are born and not made versus this sliding scale thing. As a layperson listening to what you're saying, by the time you get to 30 points out of 40, the wiring of your brain is different than us who are on the 10 or 12 points or whatever. We don't necessarily have that wiring. We just have some selfish kind of behaviors. Whereas the 30 out of 40, it's not a choice by that person. It's just the way they're wired.
Yeah, that's right. The brains of psychopaths are wired differently, and it would be possible to diagnose a child, but for moral reasons, at the moment, that's not considered desirable, but it would be possible to test for that and to come up with a diagnosis. You can also look into the brain of the individual and perform various tests and actually see how the brain is wired differently.
Interesting. All right. And maybe this is a good point to get on the record that I am not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm in no way qualified to diagnose anyone. What about your background, Inkeri?
Now, I can say that although I'm interested in this and I've done a lot of reading, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I couldn't make a formal diagnosis, but using the checklist and looking at an astrology chart, it's possible to draw conclusions. But we have to say again and again that even if you are a psychopath, it doesn't mean you're a criminal, and that these kind of people can be very successful and are typically found in careers that are very high pressure, like lawyers, surgeons, and so on.
Yeah, and they really do become, like you say, archetypes that we love to watch. on television or in movies. I don't know that we'd love to live with them, but for some reason.
The fact that it's biological and there's so many people in the population with this means that from an evolutionary point of view, there was some advantage in having people like this.
Gosh, that makes a lot of sense what you just said just then. Because when it's a fight for survival, this is a great checklist of how to survive, isn't it?
But it means that you're probably not a very nice person.
All right. So we've spoken about this checklist. Shall we have a look at the items that make up the 20 areas in this psychopathy checklist?
So we've got glibness, superficial charm. We've got a grandiose sense of self-worth, a need for stimulation, so that it's very difficult to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So they constantly need something new to do all the time and typically don't like to do anything. Someone who's a pathological liar, who's manipulative or a con artist, a lack of remorse is another characteristic. Shallow affect, which means inability to form deep, meaningful relationships or to bond with anybody. Then we've got callousness and lack of empathy, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, promiscuous behavior, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for one's own action, many short-term marital relationships. Then we've got juvenile delinquency, revocation of conditional release. Now, I think that means that if people are on bail, for example, that they're unable to stick to their bail conditions. And criminal versatility, which means that one day you could be doing an armed robbery, next day you could be committing fraud. Just to explain that each of these items is awarded a certain number of points. So you can get 1 or 2 points. So it's quite possible to get item 15 and you've already got your 30 points before we get into questions about juvenile delinquency and things like that. And that is obviously how people who are surgeons, who are lawyers, who've never been involved in crime can still be very high scoring.
So this is our list of items. We're not going to go through item by item, but we will dip into these sort of in groupings and see what we can see in the chart. Now, we've got a couple of people to look at, and today we're going to record the birth chart of Donald Trump and how this list might show up in that birth chart. This is definitely in the theme of the Astrology that we're doing at the end of the month on 30th of November. We're going to look at Sam Bankman-Fried, who's just been convicted of fraud, something in the $8 billion range for trading of cryptocurrencies. So if true crime is your kind of area of interest, like Inkeri and I, and this list of 20 items grabs your imagination, you might like to have a look at Sam's chart and see if we can also see something in his. But before we jump into looking at these items as they apply to a chart, let's first of all have an overall look at Donald Trump's chart. If you are listening along to the podcast, I'm just going to let you know the layout of the chart, and then I'll be handing over to Inkeri to give us some insights. This chart is a Leo ascendant, and in fact, the ascendant is at 29 degrees and 52 minutes of Leo. So it's incredibly late in Leo, isn't it? Just a few more minutes and it would have been a completely different chart. But we have a Leo ascendant. In that first house of Leo is Mars at 26 degrees. There are no planets in the second house of Virgo. In the third house of Libra, Jupiter is at around 17 degrees. And then there are no planets in Scorpio. In Sagittarius, the fifth house, we have Ketu and the moon. Actually, they're quite close conjunction. Ketu at 20 plus minutes and moon at only just really 21 degrees. So 20 and 21 degrees of Sagittarius, the fifth house. Then we have Capricorn, the sixth house, no planet. Aquarius, the seventh house, also no planets. No planets in Pisces, the eighth house. No planets in Aries, the ninth house, and nothing in Taurus, the 10th house. Then when we get to the 11th house of Gemini, we see that we have Rahu and the Sun, just like we saw in Sagittarius, very close together. Rahu is at that 2048, just like Ketu, and the Sun is just about 23 degrees. So Rahu and the Sun in Gemini. And finally, the 12th house has 3 planets. It has Mercury, Saturn, and Venus. That is the layout of the chart. Inkeri, what would you like to draw our attention to?
Okay, so he has a very colourful chart. He's a very polarizing figure.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. He's some people's hero and he's other people's villain. And there's not necessarily a lot of middle ground. What are some of the standout features that will help us as we work through this checklist?
So he's a Leo ascendant, and Leo is a regal, kingly sign. It's an extrovert, confident, theatrical sign. And if we look at the 29 degrees and 50 minutes of the chart, there's a real sense of urgency and something very karmic, I think, about that particular degree. Trump has embodied a very masculine energy. When we look at the psychopathy checklist in terms of, say, charm and presence, he's got this Leo ascendant with the Sun in the 11th house of games and networking, but he's also got Mars, which is the 4th and 9th lord in the first house at a degree very close to the ascendant degree. And Mars is obviously another very masculine energy. It's a warrior. It's our drive and ambition and our courage. And here it's the 4th and 9th lord. So this is bringing a real sense of dharma and purpose into the first house. So this is someone who's hugely charismatic and very dynamic.
I'm just realizing, as you're saying about his masculine energy, what you're pointing out is that the ascendant is in a masculine sign of Leo. The Sun is in a masculine sign in Gemini. And the moon is also in a masculine sign, isn't it, in Sagittarius?
Yeah,
and this is a daytime birth.
Yeah.
Am I correct? Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah.
So this person has the masculine yoga. When you have your ascendant, the sun, the moon, and it's a daytime birth, all of those are strongly resonating that masculine energy. So that's really interesting that you say that.
Another thing that we could look at is that he's got his ascendant lord in Gemini, so that he's very communicative.
I notice also coming to my attention is that Venus is located with Saturn in the 12th house. But adding to this masculine yoga that we were talking about, Venus, kind of the representation of women in charts, is starved by Saturn. And it's in the 12th house of secret bedroom pleasures. It's in a secret part of the chart. So this representation of women is in a bit of a difficult position there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for the superficial charm, because he is a very magnetic figure, we could definitely give him 2 points. And I'm sure that Donald Trump himself would be very pleased with those 2 points for his masculine energy.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm just noticing Venus is with Saturn, so it's starved and difficult, and Moon is with Ketu. So the two sort of feminine energy planets in the chart are under a bit of duress with whoever they're located with. And we haven't mentioned, just before we really do dive into those checklists, we haven't mentioned that this person is born during an eclipse.
That's right.
Okay, so we're going to now, taking what we know about his life and some of these major features of the chart, we're going to go to our checklist and have a look at what we can see in the chart. And before we do that, we just want to say that this is a unique chart with many factors interacting with each other. As you listen, you may find that you also have Venus with Saturn, or perhaps you've got Rahu with the Sun. And one cannot take these individual conjunctions or individual Rashi aspects as verbatim apply to every chart. We have to look at the whole interaction of the unique chart. So don't worry too much if you hear something that's in your chart doesn't necessarily mean that it is manifesting in the same way in your chart, because you've got a unique chart with unique placements. So we've taken our list of 20 indicators, and you remember we had the first item was glibness, superficial charm, and the second item was grandiose sense of self-worth. So we definitely have kept those together, and we've just popped into that group item 9, parasitic lifestyle, and item 13, lack of realistic long-term goals. So if we think about these all together, what can we say from the chart?
The grandiose sense of self-worth. I think we've got to go to Sun and Rahu in the 11th house for this. Also with regard to the lack of realistic long-term goals. Now, obviously, Trump achieved his goals, but they certainly appear to be very unrealistic in the sense that he was the only president who never had any political or military experience before being elected. When he started his campaign, it seemed utterly impossible, even to his campaign team, that he'd have any chance succeeding. So if we look at it in that way, that he's just so incredibly ambitious and that he puts no limits on himself.
And that's happening in that 11th house of ambition, as you're pointing out. The aspirations of this person are very stimulated. And let's just say a little bit of something about Rahu-Sun, that the sun is a luminary. It's a very important planet in everybody's chart. It represents something about the soul or the inner brilliance or light of a person. And when it's with Rahu, Rahu can amplify that in a way, can't it? Nodes are interesting when they're with luminaries, and it can make someone, I guess, a little bit emperor's new clothes, isn't it? That the Rahu kind of amplifies the sun and makes it seem even more than possibly it is. And there it is happening in the 11th house of aspirations and ambitions.
Absolutely. The sun has also got very strong Shadbala in this chart, but it's Vrida and it's Swapna, so it's not going to be working in a healthy way. So it's ambition, if you like, for the sake of ambition. The sun is the first lord here. It represents the soul. So its own agenda and its own advancement are going to be absolutely key. And you've got Rahu absolutely magnifying this exponentially.
I think you're making a good point there, Inkeri, that it's hypnotic. It's in the house of communication. It's the sun, which is magnetic, that it's holding the whole center of the solar system together. And this person is going to have powerful communication impact on people, and almost, like you say, hypnotic, like an illusionist. People can't look away, can they?
He's able to generate these and get people to latch on to them.
Picking up on something else that you're saying, we've got the first lord in the 11th house, and with Rahu amplifying that. So this is really ambitious, as we said. But I notice also that the Atmakaraka is Mars, and it's in the first house.
Right next to the ascended degree, which is just incredible.
which is actually a Raja Yoga, right? It's ruling the 4th and the 9th house, and it's in the 1st house. So it's a very auspicious placement.
And all of that is aspected by Jupiter as well.
Rashi aspect from Jupiter there. If we go to our checklist, let me give you the wording again. Grandiose sense of self-worth. I think we can say that there is definitely some indicator for that in the chart. And also here it says glibness and superficial charm. What we could certainly say is charm and charisma.
That's how I would interpret it. But also the glibness, I think, refers to his love of communication and how he takes to Twitter. And he's always ready to fire off comments on all kinds of topics.
Yeah. It's that classic Mars thing of shoot first, ask questions later, isn't it? We don't necessarily need the facts. Anyway, that is our first bunch of items. Now, let's jump ahead a little bit because you just mentioned conning and manipulation. And that's item 5. And we've put it together with item 4, which is pathological lying. So let's have a look at lying and manipulation. Can we see that in the chart?
One thing that we can look at, I think, is that you've got Saturn in Cancer with Venus and Mercury. And Saturn is all about discipline and restriction. And the 12th house is no boundary. Saturn's in great enemy dignity. And it's with Mercury that's the planet of intelligence. We've got Venus is the 3rd lord of written communication and Mercury is speech. So they are in the 12th house of secrets, but it's the fact that they're starved by Saturn.
So when we talk about this chronic lying or conning and manipulation, we have the 2 lords related to communication, Venus and Mercury, both being starved by Lajatadivashta by Saturn.
In a sign which has got no limits. So Saturn is going to operate without any limits. This conjunction in the 12th house isn't just responsible for the lying and manipulative behavior, but it's also the lack of remorse and callousness, lack of empathy for others, because Mercury is a planet of friendship. And when it is starved by Saturn, then it is unable to connect deeply with other people.
So this is looking like a cluster here in Cancer that is feeding into many of the items from the checklist. Let's just return to that. So we were looking at pathological lying and manipulation. So we've talked about those, but we're also wrapping in there item 6, lack of remorse or guilt. Item 8, callous lack of empathy. Even maybe item 7, a shallow effect, in that this is Cancer is the home of emotions as far as the zodiac sign goes. And this person has Saturn there starving those Rajasic planets, Venus and Mercury.
And having the 6th lord in the 12th makes someone a poor loser.
Gosh. And we've got some other items in this bunch together. We've got item 15, irresponsibility, and item 16, failure to accept responsibility for one's own actions. So in some ways, a lot of things taking place in that 12th house being fed by a very powerful 1st house lord, the sun with Rahu kind of combination that's just hypnotic in this house of communication. People can't take their eyes away from this person. And Mars, the Atmakaraka, is a Raj Yoga on the 1st house. So a lot of charisma there as well. It's a potent mix, isn't it, Inkeri?
Absolutely. And then you've got Jupiter, which is the 8th lord, in Venus's sign Libra, which is the 3rd house, which is all about personal desires. And Jupiter will magnify that. So it will produce a lot of lust, promiscuous behavior. Not just Jupiter being the 8th lord in the 3rd house, but Venus in bad dignity in 12th, which is all about sexual pleasures.
And that is also on the checklist, isn't it?
Promiscuity and short-term marital relationships. And Trump has had various sexual harassment claims made against him.
And we've put that in a cluster of items around impulsivity. That was item 11, promiscuous sexual behavior. Item 17, many short-term marital relationships. But we've also got Item 3, the need for stimulation. This person is prone to boredom. Item 10, poor behavioral controls. And item 14, impulsivity. Are there any other indicators in the chart that you want to speak to around that cluster before we wrap up on these 20 items of the checklist? I'm immediately drawn to Mars is on the ascendant. This person's going to feel empowered to take action. And then I'm also looking at Rahu with the Sun in the 11th because the Sun is the first house lord. And I think Rahu can make us impulsive, make us do things that we don't really know the consequences of.
Jupiter being the 8th lord in a house of desires. And if Jupiter's not working well, then it's going to make somebody rely on luck and take chances without thinking too much about the consequences.
Yes, over-optimistic.
Yeah.
I think when we zoom back now and have a look at our list of 20 items, we can see how this conjunction of Rahu-Sun in the 11th house, the ascendant lord with Rahu in the 11th house, combined with Venus and Mercury, our lords of communication, being starved with Saturn in the 12th in Cancer, and then Jupiter, the 8th lord, in the 3rd house. All of these items together are giving us a lot of information about the 20 items on our checklist.
And look at this as well. The Sun's got almost 600 points of Shagbala.
Yeah. It's very powerful.
Yeah. And he's got the Drigbala, which is just luck that just happens. He's got 66 points associated with the Sun.
That is off the charts, isn't it?
Yeah. I think the moon in Ketu is also very interesting.
Did you want to say anything about the moon in Ketu? We haven't said much about that.
No, I think the moon with Ketu in the 5th house can have difficulties in communication.
It is the 12th lord here, isn't it?
Negative indicators, prone to treachery, speaks ill of others.
We noticed that the 5th house is about investments and gambling. And we have here the 12th lord. So some secrets there. There's a bit of risk taking there as well, I imagine. And maybe a sense with Ketu being there that the person, no matter what they do, it's not quite enough. They always want more in terms of investments.
I think what's interesting here is about communication. And Trump is a very effective communicator. Having the moon in the 5th house, he'll be highly attuned to public opinion. And he's very astute at controlling situations from behind the scenes. So the moon as the 12th lord, which is the behind the scenes aspect in the 5th house, means that he's able to promote his view of the world to his advantage. And Trump is constantly complaining about fake news and also creating his own version of reality.
And I think creating one's own version of reality is quite important in this psychopathy thing, isn't it? That it's almost like such a personal belief in one's perceptions that one's perceptions become reality as far as that person is concerned.
Yeah.
Reality is what they perceive. And therefore, everything that they're doing makes sense on the inside. The person is completely believing their perceptions as reality rather than taking in data from the outside world.
Well, your own perceptions absolutely are the truth and nobody else's view has got any weight at all.
So you've given us some really interesting things to think about here, Inkeri, as we look at this very rich chart and all of these different ways that behavior can show up, from the lying to the manipulation to the unrealistic goals to the promiscuity, impulsivity. There's so many fascinating insights. I'm wondering whether you will join us again another time, Inkeri, to talk about Bernie Madoff. He has a diagnosis of being a psychopath and he was convicted of fraud.
Absolutely. He got 150 years and he died in jail.
Gosh. So will you come back and talk to us about another case study to run through the checklist?
Absolutely. With great pleasure. I'll look forward to it.
Wonderful. And if this has whet anybody's appetite to analyze a little bit more, you're all welcome to come along to Astrolojam on the 30th of November. We're going to be looking at the chart of Sam Bankman-Fried, who just got convicted of billions of dollars of fraud in cryptocurrency exchanges. So I wonder if we'll see some similar characteristics. Thank you all so much for staying with us on the Vedic Astrology podcast. Thank you for being here, Inkeri, and I look forward to having listeners join us again in the future when we get back together on the Vedic Astrology podcast.
Thanks very much, Fiona.
All right. Bye, everyone.